The road through the Kentucky mountains in 1847 was not merely dangerous, it was a passage through shadow and stone where civilization thinned to nothing more than wheel ruts carved into wilderness. Travelers who survived the journey spoke of more than bandits and broken axles. They whispered about a place where the darkness felt different, thicker, hungry, but they also spoke of salvation. Nestled in a valley where three mountain ridges converged like the fingers of a closing fist, there stood an establishment that defied every brutal expectation of frontier hospitality. Millbrook Inn rose from the Kentucky wilderness like a cathedral of comfort, its windows glowing amber against the encroaching forest. Smoke curled from its chimneys, carrying the scent of roasted meat and fresh bread for miles down the mountain pass. And inside, 4 women waited with smiles that could make a man forget every hardship that had brought him to their door. The Cunningham sisters, Margaret, Catherine, Sarah, and Elizabeth. Their names were spoken with reverence in taverns from Virginia to Tennessee. Cattlemen would plan their routes specifically to pass through that remote valley. Merchants carrying small fortunes in coin and trade goods would risk adding 2 weeks to their journey just to spend 3 nights under the Cunningham roof. Even the most hardened frontiersmen, men who trusted nothing and no one, would arrive at Millbrook Inn as strangers and depart as believers. Believers in what, exactly, depended on who you asked. Some said it was the food. Sarah Cunningham could transform wild game and mountain vegetables into meals that rivaled anything served in Louisville's finest restaurants. Her venison stew had reduced grown men to tears. Her blackberry preserves tasted like captured summer. Her herbal teas could cure ailments that had plagued travelers for months. Others insisted it was the comfort. The beds at Millbrook Inn featured actual feather mattresses, not the straw-filled sacks common to frontier lodging. The rooms were heated by individual fireplaces that never seemed to die during the night. The linens smelled of lavender and were changed between guests, a luxury so rare in 1847 that some visitors suspected witchcraft. But the men who returned again and again, who altered their business schedules and invented reasons to travel through that particular stretch of Kentucky wilderness, they knew the real truth. It was the sisters themselves. Margaret Cunningham, the eldest at 32, possessed a mind that could calculate profit margins and read human nature with equal precision. She could discuss politics with state senators, debate theology with traveling preachers, and negotiate livestock prices with cattle barons, always leaving her conversational partners feeling intellectually stimulated and genuinely heard. She had a way of making every man believe he was the most fascinating person she had ever encountered. Catherine, 30 years old, had been blessed with the kind of beauty that stops conversations. Golden hair that caught lamplight like spun copper. Eyes the color of Kentucky bluegrass after rain. A figure that even the most modest traveling dress could not entirely disguise. But it was not her appearance that made her dangerous. It was her attention. Catherine listened to men in a way their wives had stopped listening years ago. She remembered details from conversations held months apart. She made lonely travelers feel seen, understood, and desired in ways they had forgotten were possible. Sarah, 28, moved through the inn like a spirit of healing and nourishment. She knew every plant in the surrounding mountains and could identify medicinal herbs by scent alone. She brewed remedies for ailments ranging from sour stomach to melancholy of the spirit. Travelers who arrived sick or injured often credited Sarah Cunningham with saving their lives. What they did not know was that Sarah understood death just as intimately as she understood healing. She knew which plants could cure and which could kill. She knew the dosages where medicine became poison, and she kept careful notes about both. Elizabeth, the youngest at 24, radiated an innocence that seemed impossible for someone raised in such isolation. She played piano with genuine skill, sang in a voice that reminded hardened men of their mothers and sisters, and possessed a laugh that could lighten even the darkest mood. Guests found themselves confiding their deepest fears and greatest dreams to Elizabeth, never suspecting that every word was being catalogued and analyzed for weakness and vulnerability. Together, the four sisters had built something unprecedented. Millbrook Inn was not simply a place to sleep between the dangers of mountain travel. It was an experience, an escape, a fantasy made tangible where every masculine need, from intellectual stimulation to physical comfort to emotional connection, was anticipated and fulfilled with practiced precision. The inn itself reflected the sisters' attention to detail. The main building, constructed from hand-hewn logs and Kentucky limestone, featured 12 guest rooms, each appointed with furniture that would not have been out of place in a Richmond mansion. The common area, dominated by a fireplace large enough to roast an entire deer, provided space for conversation, cards, and the kind of easy companionship that develops between travelers sharing stories over good whiskey. The whiskey, incidentally, came from the inn's own distillery, operated with help from 2 employees whose loyalty to the Cunningham sisters bordered on religious devotion. The brothers, Klaus and Heinrich Zimmer, had arrived from Bavaria 5 years earlier, speaking broken English and carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs. The sisters had given them work, shelter, and purpose. In return, the Zimmer brothers provided labor, discretion, and the kind of unquestioning obedience that made them invaluable for tasks that required strong backs and closed mouths. The third employee, Ezra Hawthorne, had worked for the Cunningham family since before the sisters were born. He was a mountain man in the truest sense, weathered by decades of frontier life, capable of tracking prey through conditions that would leave younger men lost and frozen. Ezra managed the stables, led hunting expeditions for guests who wanted to bag a trophy buck, and served as the inn's connection to the scattered settlements throughout the region. His reputation for honesty was beyond question. When Ezra Hawthorne vouched for something, people believed him. This was important, because by the spring of 1847, there were questions starting to circulate through the Kentucky territories. Quiet questions, asked in hushed tones between men who were not quite sure they wanted to know the answers. Questions about travelers who had never completed their journeys. A tobacco merchant from North Carolina who had been heading to Louisville with payment for an entire season's crop, last seen approaching Millbrook Inn on a Tuesday evening in October of 1845. Never arrived in Louisville. His business partners assumed bandits. His wagon was never found. A land surveyor from Pennsylvania, mapping territories for the state government, scheduled to deliver his completed work in the spring of 1846, never showed. His surveying equipment, worth considerable money, vanished with him. The state assumed he had fallen victim to one of the region's many natural hazards: bears, cliffs, sudden storms. The frontier claimed lives regularly. No one thought to investigate further. A cattle buyer from Virginia who had been traveling with nearly $2,000 in gold coin. He had written to his sister about staying at a remarkable inn run by 4 enterprising women. That letter, received in late 1846, was the last anyone heard from him. His sister filed a missing person report with local authorities. The investigation went nowhere. Men disappeared on the frontier. It was a fact of life in 1847. By themselves, these disappearances meant nothing. The road through the Kentucky mountains was dangerous. Travelers vanished all the time, victims of weather, wildlife, criminals, or simple misfortune. The wilderness was vast and indifferent. Bodies could lie undiscovered for decades if they wandered off the main paths. But there was a pattern forming for anyone who cared to look closely enough. And in the spring of 1847, someone finally did. His name was Thomas Brennan, and he was a federal marshal operating out of Lexington. Brennan had spent 20 years tracking outlaws and investigating crimes across 3 territories. He had developed instincts that bordered on supernatural. When he reviewed the files of missing persons from the past decade, cross-referencing their last known locations with a map of Kentucky's wilderness road, one location appeared again and again: Millbrook Inn. Brennan was not a man who jumped to conclusions. He understood that correlation was not causation. An inn located on a major travel route would naturally be the last confirmed stop for many people who subsequently vanished. That proved nothing. But 15 separate disappearances over 12 years, all involving men traveling alone, all carrying significant amounts of money or valuable goods, all last confirmed to be staying at the same establishment run by 4 women with no male protection. That warranted a closer look. Brennan began his investigation carefully. He did not ride directly to Millbrook Inn and start asking questions. Instead, he approached from the edges, gathering information from sources the sisters would never know to monitor. He spoke with blacksmiths who remembered shoeing horses that matched descriptions of mounts belonging to missing travelers. The animals had been sold through legitimate channels weeks or months after their owners vanished, always by intermediaries who claimed to be acting on behalf of sellers who had decided to settle in Kentucky rather than continue their journeys. He interviewed merchants who had purchased goods, surveying equipment, personal items, even weapons, that seemed oddly familiar when he read descriptions from missing person reports. The sellers were always different people, none connected to Millbrook Inn, but the items themselves told a story of systematic disposal of evidence. He examined land records and discovered that the Cunningham sisters had become substantial property owners over the past decade, acquiring parcels throughout the region through purchases that seemed inconsistent with the income a remote inn should generate, even a successful one. Most tellingly, he spoke with families of the missing men. He asked about their relatives' personalities, their habits, their weaknesses. A pattern emerged that chilled him despite years of experience with human darkness. Every single missing man had been lonely. Widowers, bachelors, men estranged from their families, men whose work kept them isolated for months at a time, men who had accumulated money but had no one to share their lives with. Men who were vulnerable to the promise of connection, to the illusion of being cared for, to the fantasy that 4 beautiful, intelligent women might see them as more than just another paying customer. Brennan understood what he was looking at. He had seen variations of this pattern before, though never on such a scale or executed with such sophistication. This was not random violence. This was systematic predation, with a carefully refined victim selection process. He needed proof. In early April of 1847, Marshal Thomas Brennan adopted the identity of Jacob Morrison, a wealthy textile merchant from Baltimore, supposedly traveling to Nashville to investigate investment opportunities in Tennessee's growing cotton industry. He carried letters of credit totaling $5,000, wore expensive clothes, and made sure to mention in several taverns along his route that he was recently widowed and finding the loneliness of travel increasingly difficult to bear. He was, in other words, precisely the kind of target the Cunningham sisters would find irresistible. When Jacob Morrison's horse crested the final ridge and Millbrook Inn came into view on a cold April evening, he felt something he rarely experienced in his line of work: fear. Not fear of death. Brennan had faced that many times and made peace with his mortality years ago. This was something different. It was the fear of being right. The fear that his investigation had led him to a place where evil had been flourishing in plain sight for over a decade. The fear that he was about to discover that human nature could be even darker than his considerable experience had taught him to expect. The inn looked exactly as it had been described: welcoming, warm, safe. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, lamplight glowed in the windows. He could hear piano music drifting across the darkening valley. Everything about the scene suggested refuge and comfort. Brennan urged his horse forward, down the winding path toward Millbrook Inn, toward the sisters who were waiting inside, toward the truth about what had happened to 43 men who had ridden down this same path and never been seen again. Margaret Cunningham opened the door before Brennan could dismount. She had been watching from the window, as she always did when horses approached after dark. First impressions mattered in their business, And Margaret understood that the moment a traveller first saw her face would determine whether he relaxed or remained guarded. She smiled, not too broadly, not with the desperate eagerness of someone hungry for business, just the warm, professional welcome of a woman who ran a respectable establishment and took genuine pleasure in providing hospitality to weary travellers. "Good evening, sir. You've had a long journey by the look of it." Her voice carried concern without familiarity, respect without servility. "I'm Margaret Cunningham. Welcome to Millbrook Inn." Brennan dismounted, studying her face in the lamplight that spilled from the doorway. She was exactly as witnesses had described her, handsome rather than beautiful, with intelligent eyes that assessed him just as carefully as he was assessing her. There was confidence in her posture, competence in her movements. This was a woman accustomed to being in control. "Jacob Morrison," he said, offering his hand, "from Baltimore. I was beginning to think I'd be sleeping under the stars tonight. This road is more challenging than I was led to believe. The mountains can be unforgiving to those who don't know them." Margaret replied, shaking his hand with a firm grip that surprised him. "But you're safe now, Mr. Morrison. We'll take good care of you." Those words, "You're safe now." Brennan wondered how many men had heard them spoken in that exact tone, with that exact mixture of warmth and assurance, never suspecting they had just been marked for death. Klaus Zimmer appeared from the stable to take Brennan's horse. The German gave a respectful nod, but said nothing, his eyes avoiding direct contact. Brennan noted the man's powerful build, the kind of strength that came from years of hard physical labor, the kind of strength that would be useful for tasks requiring discretion and efficiency. Inside, the inn exceeded every description Brennan had heard. The common room radiated warmth from a fireplace that roared with split oak and hickory. The furniture was sturdy and comfortable, clearly built to last rather than assembled from whatever materials were cheaply available. Everything was clean, not just tidy, but genuinely clean, in a way that was rare on the frontier. The floor had been swept and scrubbed. The windows showed no accumulation of grime. Even the air smelled fresh, touched with lavender and wood smoke, and something Brennan could not quite identify. Something sweet and slightly medicinal. 3 other women emerged from various doorways as Margaret led him into the common area. They arranged themselves with the unconscious choreography of people who had performed this greeting ritual hundreds of times. "My sisters," Margaret said. "Catherine, Sarah, and Elizabeth." Catherine stepped forward first. Brennan felt the impact of her beauty like a physical blow. The lamplight loved her, catching gold highlights in her hair and making her skin seem to glow from within. But it was her eyes that truly captured attention. They fixed on him with an intensity that suggested he was the only person in the world at that moment. "Mr. Morrison," she said softly, "you look exhausted. When did you last have a proper meal?" Before Brennan could answer, Sarah appeared at his elbow with a steaming cup. "Herbal tea," she explained. "My own blend. It will help with the soreness from riding. I imagine you've been in the saddle for quite some time." The cup was warm in his hands. The liquid inside smelled of mint and something else he could not identify. Some root or bark he had never encountered before. His instinct screamed at him not to drink anything these women prepared, but refusing would raise immediate suspicion. He took a small sip. The tea was delicious, warming, soothing, in a way that went beyond its temperature. He felt tension he had not realized he was carrying begin to ease from his shoulders. That scared him more than anything else so far, because if Sarah Cunningham could create something that made him feel this good with simple herbs and hot water, what else might she be capable of brewing? Elizabeth, the youngest, was studying him with open curiosity. "You're from Baltimore? I've always wanted to see a real city. What's it like to walk down streets where you can't see the mountains?" The question was perfectly innocent, perfectly natural, exactly what a young woman isolated in the Kentucky wilderness might ask a sophisticated traveler from the East. But Brennan heard the calculation beneath it. She was gathering information, learning about him. establishing rapport through apparent vulnerability and genuine interest. "Crowded," he replied with a careful smile. "Noisy. Sometimes I think the mountains have the better arrangement. Peace and quiet are luxuries in Baltimore." "You're traveling alone?" Margaret asked, her tone casual as she gestured for him to sit near the fire. The question was not casual at all. It was the first probe, the initial test to determine his vulnerability and potential value. "My wife passed 2 years ago," Brennan said, allowing genuine sadness to color his voice. This was the role he had chosen, and he would play it perfectly. "I've found that keeping busy with business helps manage the grief. But yes, I travel alone now. There's no one waiting for me in Baltimore anymore." He watched their reactions carefully. Margaret's expression showed appropriate sympathy. Catherine's eyes softened with compassion that might have been genuine. Sarah nodded with understanding. Elizabeth reached out and briefly touched his arm in a gesture of comfort. 4 different responses. 4 unique approaches to the same information. They were not simply reacting. They were working together, each sister playing a specific role in a carefully orchestrated performance designed to make him feel understood, valued, and most importantly, safe. "You must be hungry," Sarah said. "I have venison stew that's been simmering all afternoon, fresh cornbread, apple preserves put up last autumn." The meal that followed was extraordinary. Sarah had not been exaggerating her culinary skills. The venison was tender enough to cut with a fork, seasoned with herbs that enhanced rather than overwhelmed the meat's natural flavor. The cornbread was sweet and rich, clearly made with real butter rather than the lard common to frontier cooking. The preserves tasted like captured sunshine. Brennan ate carefully, aware that every bite might contain something other than food. But he was also genuinely hungry, and refusal would raise questions he could not afford to answer. He watched the sisters eat from the same dishes, saw them drink from the same pitcher of cider he was offered. Whatever they used to incapacitate their victims, it was not deployed during communal meals. That made sense. Victims who became sick or died too quickly would raise immediate suspicion. The sisters needed time to establish trust, to create emotional connections, to ensure their targets were thoroughly isolated and vulnerable before the final act. As dinner progressed, Brennan found himself genuinely impressed despite his horror at what these women had accomplished. They were skilled conversationalists, each bringing different strengths to the table. Margaret engaged him on business and politics, demonstrating knowledge that would have been impressive in a Baltimore salon, let alone a remote Kentucky inn. Catherine drew out his personal story with questions that seemed caring rather than intrusive. Sarah discussed herbal medicine and frontier survival with an expertise that came from years of practical experience. Elizabeth provided lightness and laughter, making him smile despite the darkness of his mission. If he had truly been Jacob Morrison, lonely widower and successful businessman, he would have been utterly charmed. He would have extended his stay. He would have started thinking about reasons to return. He would have begun to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had found something precious in this isolated mountain valley. He would have been exactly where they wanted him. After dinner, the conversation continued in the common room. 2 other guests were present, both traveling merchants who clearly thought themselves lucky to be staying at Millbrook Inn. They participated in the discussion with the easy camaraderie of men who had been made comfortable, comparing notes on road conditions and trade opportunities while the sisters moved between them with practiced attention. Brennan noted how the sisters managed the dynamics. Margaret anchored the conversation, ensuring everyone felt included. Catherine provided individual focus, making each man feel special when she turned her attention to him. Sarah kept glasses filled and ensured everyone's comfort. Elizabeth circulated with effortless charm, a connecting thread between all the separate conversations. It was masterful. Around 10 o'clock, the other guests retired to their rooms. Brennan made moves to do the same, but Catherine appeared at his side with 2 glasses of amber liquid. "Before you go," she said quietly, "I thought you might enjoy some of our whiskey. It's made here on the property. Klaus learned the technique from his grandfather in Bavaria. The whiskey glass was crystal, catching firelight in its facets. The liquid inside was the color of dark honey. Brennan accepted it with appropriate gratitude, knowing that refusing would mark him as suspicious. "Join me?" he asked, gesturing to the chairs by the fire. Catherine smiled and settled into the seat across from him. The other sisters had disappeared, leaving them alone in the lamplight. The fire crackled. Outside, wind moved through the mountains with a sound like distant voices. "It must be difficult," Catherine said after they had sat in comfortable silence for several moments, traveling alone, coming back to empty lodgings night after night. "You understand it well," Brennan replied. "Have you experienced that kind of loss?" "In a different way." Catherine stared into the fire, her profile perfect in the flickering light. "We lost our parents young. The four of us, we've only ever had each other. I suppose that's a different kind of loneliness. Being surrounded by family but still feeling isolated from the wider world." The conversation that followed lasted nearly 2 hours. Catherine was brilliant at drawing him out, at making him feel heard and understood. She asked about his late wife, his business, his hopes for the future. She shared carefully selected details about life at the inn, about the challenges of running a business in such isolation, about dreams of someday seeing the cities and culture she had only read about in books. Brennan found himself having to consciously maintain his cover story. Catherine was that good. She made vulnerability feel safe. She made confession feel like connection. If he had not known what she truly was, he might have found himself actually confiding in her. The whiskey was excellent, smooth and complex, with notes of oak and vanilla. He sipped it slowly, aware that alcohol could loosen his tongue and compromise his judgment. Catherine matched his pace, and they talked until the fire burned low, and the oil in the lamps needed refilling. "I should let you rest," Catherine finally said, rising with fluid grace. "Tomorrow, if you're not in too much hurry, Elizabeth could show you around the property. We have quite beautiful views from the ridge above the inn." "I'd like that," Brennan said, meaning it. He needed to see the full extent of the property, needed to understand the geography and identify possible burial sites. An escorted tour would provide perfect cover for reconnaissance. Catherine paused at the base of the stairs leading to the guest rooms. "I'm glad you found us, Jacob, truly. Men like you, good men who've experienced loss and kept their kindness intact, you deserve to feel welcomed somewhere in this harsh world." She touched his hand briefly, her fingers cool and soft, then disappeared up the stairs. Brennan stood alone in the common room, listening to the fire settle and the wind outside. He reviewed everything he had observed: the sisters' coordination, their individual specializations, the way they gathered information and built trust, the isolation of the property, the loyal employees who asked no questions. He thought about the 43 men who had stood in this exact spot, feeling exactly what he was supposed to be feeling. Welcome, safe, cared for, perhaps even the beginnings of hope that life might hold pleasant surprises after all. None of them had survived. Brennan climbed the stairs to his assigned room. It was comfortable and clean, the bed inviting after days of hard travel. But he did not sleep. Instead, he sat in the chair by the window, watching the darkness outside and the lamplight that still glowed from several of the inn's windows. Somewhere out there, beneath Kentucky soil, or hidden in mountain caves, 43 bodies were waiting to tell their stories. Brennan intended to make sure their voices were finally heard. But first, he had to survive long enough to bring these women to justice. And as he sat in the darkness of that comfortable room, listening to the old building settle around him, he realized something that made his blood run cold. He was not sure he was going to make it out alive. The next morning arrived with mountain fog so thick it turned the world ghostly. Brennan woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon, having finally dozed off sometime near dawn. Sunlight, filtered through the fog, gave everything a dreamlike quality. When he descended to the common room, he found the other two guests already at breakfast, enthusiastically praising Sarah's cooking. Margaret was reviewing accounts at a small desk in the corner, every inch the competent businesswoman. Elizabeth was clearing dishes with cheerful efficiency. Catherine was nowhere to be seen. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison," Margaret said without looking up from her ledger. "I trust you slept well." "Very well, thank you." Brennan accepted a cup of coffee from Elizabeth, noting how the young woman's hands were steady and sure. No trembling, no nervousness. Whatever these women had done, whatever horrors they had orchestrated, they showed no outward signs of guilt or fear. That was perhaps the most chilling thing about them, their normalcy, their apparent genuineness. If evil could look like this, friendly and competent and caring, then how could anyone ever feel truly safe? "Catherine mentioned you might be interested in seeing the property," Elizabeth said brightly. "The fog should burn off in an hour or so. Would you like to take a walk with me then? There are some truly spectacular views from the ridge, and this time of year the wildflowers are just beginning to bloom." "I would be delighted," Brennan replied, seeing his opportunity. An hour alone with the youngest sister, the one who might be most vulnerable to skilled questioning, while surveying the property for evidence of where bodies might be hidden. Breakfast was another culinary triumph. Fluffy eggs, perfectly crisped bacon, biscuits that melted in your mouth, and gravy rich enough to be sinful. The two merchant guests were planning to depart after the meal, settling their accounts with Margaret and heaping praise on the sisters' hospitality. Brennan watched them ride away down the mountain path, wondering if they realized how fortunate they were. Wrong age, wrong circumstances, probably insufficient wealth. Whatever criteria the sisters used for selecting victims, these men had not met them. They would live to tell others about the wonderful inn run by the charming Cunningham sisters, never knowing they had slept under the same roof where dozens of men had drawn their final breaths. True to Elizabeth's prediction, the fog began lifting around mid-morning. Brennan collected his coat, and the young woman led him outside into air that tasted of spring and growing things. "We'll go up to the ridge first," Elizabeth said as they walked. "On clear days you can see for 20 miles. It reminds you how small we are, how vast the world is, beyond our little valley." The path climbed steadily through mixed forest. Elizabeth moved with the easy confidence of someone who had walked these trails countless times. She pointed out plants and trees, sharing knowledge clearly passed down from Sarah. This herb for headaches, that bark for fever, these berries poisonous unless properly prepared. That last comment made Brennan's attention sharpen. "Your sister Sarah knows a great deal about such things." "Oh yes," Elizabeth said proudly. "She's saved several lives over the years, travelers arriving sick or injured. She has gifts that go beyond normal medicine. It's almost like the mountains themselves tell her what's needed." They reached the ridge, and Brennan had to admit the view was spectacular. The valley spread below them, the inn visible as a collection of buildings surrounded by cleared fields and forest. Beyond, mountain ridges folded into the distance, layer after layer of blue-green wilderness. "Beautiful," he said truthfully. "Sometimes I think about leaving," Elizabeth said quietly, surprising him with her candor. "Seeing what's beyond all these mountains. But then I remember that we have something special here. Something worth protecting." "Your family," Brennan prompted. "My sisters," Elizabeth corrected. "We've been through things together that bonded us in ways most people couldn't understand. We trust each other completely. We would do anything to protect what we've built." The way she said it made Brennan's skin crawl, because he heard the real meaning beneath the words. "We've committed crimes together. We share terrible secrets. We're bound by blood and murder, and that bond is unbreakable." "You're very close," he observed. "We have to be." Elizabeth turned from the view to look directly at him. For just a moment, her mask slipped. Her eyes held something cold and calculating that had nothing to do with the innocent young woman she pretended to be. "In a place like this, so far from law and civilization, all you have is family. and the strength to do what's necessary to survive. Then the mask was back in place, and she was smiling again, gesturing to a path that led along the ridge. "Come on, I'll show you the spring where we get our water, the clearest, coldest water you've ever tasted." As they walked, Brennan studied the geography with trained eyes. The ridge would provide excellent vantage points for lookouts. The forest was dense enough to hide activities from casual observers. There were rock formations that could conceal cave entrances, draws and hollows, where bodies could be buried without risk of discovery. This was a perfect killing ground, isolated, defensible, full of natural features that could hide evidence for decades or forever. Elizabeth led him to a spring that bubbled from between rocks, forming a pool so clear you could count pebbles on the bottom. She knelt and cupped water in her hands, drinking deeply before offering him the same. The water was indeed the coldest, clearest he had ever tasted. It also gave him an opportunity to study the surrounding area without obvious scrutiny. 30 yards away, partially concealed by brush, he spotted what looked like a trail leading deeper into the forest. A trail that showed signs of use, but was deliberately obscured. "What's down that way?" he asked casually. Elizabeth followed his gaze, and for just a heartbeat something flickered across her face. Wariness? Fear? Then it was gone. "Old hunting paths," she said. "The mountains are full of them. Some made by animals, some by hunters over the years. Easy to get lost if you don't know the terrain." A warning. Subtle but clear. Stay on the approved paths. Don't go wandering where you're not supposed to be. They continued the tour, Elizabeth pointing out various features of the property while Brennan committed every detail to memory. By the time they returned to the inn for lunch, he had identified at least 3 areas that warranted closer investigation. Places where the forest was just a bit too deliberately overgrown, where paths seemed to lead nowhere, where the land held secrets that someone had worked hard to keep hidden. Lunch was lighter than breakfast, but equally delicious. Margaret joined them, discussing Brennan's travel plans with apparent casual interest, while actually probing for information about his schedule, his destination, his connections. "Nashville, you said?" Margaret confirmed. "Investigating textile investments?" "That's right. Though I'm in no particular hurry." Brennan smiled. "I have letters of credit and no pressing obligations. In fact, I'm finding this area quite interesting. The land values seem remarkable, given the access to major trade routes." He saw Margaret's eyes light up with interest. A wealthy man with liquid assets and no fixed schedule, discussing potential land purchases in the area, which would give him reasons to extend his stay and return multiple times. He was painting himself as the perfect target, and they were taking the bait. Over the next 3 days, Brennan watched the sisters' operation unfold with the horrified fascination of a man witnessing a perfectly engineered trap closing around its prey. The prey, in this case, was supposed to be him. But he had an advantage the previous 43 victims had lacked. He knew what he was looking at. That knowledge, however, did not make him safe. If anything, it made his position more precarious. One slip, one moment where his reactions did not match the character he was portraying, and these women would realize they had misjudged their target. And Brennan had no illusions about what would happen then. The sisters escalated their campaign with calculated precision. Margaret began spending hours discussing potential land investments with him, producing detailed knowledge of property values, timber rights, and mineral deposits that would have impressed professional speculators. She painted a vision of wealth that could be built in this region by someone with capital and vision. More importantly, she made him feel like a valued advisor, someone whose business acumen she respected and wanted to learn from. Sarah's role became clearer as well. She began preparing special meals just for him, dishes supposedly tailored to help with the various minor ailments she claimed to observe. Slight tension in his shoulders that suggested old riding injuries, a tightness around his eyes that indicated poor sleep, a pallor to his skin that might mean digestive troubles. None of these conditions actually existed, but Sarah described them with such medical certainty that Brennan found himself almost believing her diagnoses. And with each diagnosis came a remedy: herbal teas for sleep, poultices for sore muscles, tonics for digestive health. He accepted everything she offered, then later disposed of the substances when he was certain no one was watching. The teas went out his window. The poultices were buried in the woods during his morning walks. The tonics were poured into the gaps between floorboards in his room. Because Brennan understood exactly what Sarah was doing, she was establishing a pattern of him consuming her preparations, building a medical history that would explain any sudden illness or death. When the time came to administer the final dose, there would be a documented trail showing he had been taking various remedies for existing health conditions. His death would appear to be either a sudden deterioration of those conditions or perhaps an accidental overdose of medicine he had been taking regularly. It was brilliant, diabolical, and it would have worked perfectly on someone who did not know what to look for. Elizabeth continued her role as the innocent, using apparent naivety to extract information while creating emotional connections. She asked about his late wife, drawing out stories and details with such genuine-seeming compassion that Brennan had to remind himself this young woman was complicit in mass murder. She shared carefully selected vulnerabilities of her own, creating the illusion of mutual trust and deepening intimacy. But it was Catherine who represented the greatest danger, because Catherine was not trying to be his doctor, his business advisor, or his confidant. Catherine was offering something far more powerful and infinitely harder to resist. She was offering him love. Not overtly, nothing so crude as direct seduction. Instead, she created moments, fleeting touches that seemed accidental, glances that lingered just slightly too long, conversations that drifted into topics of loneliness and connection and the human need for intimacy. She positioned herself as someone who understood the particular pain of his widowhood, who recognized the specific shape of the emptiness in his life. On the fourth evening of his stay, after the other guests had retired and the household had settled into nighttime quiet, Catherine found Brennan reading by the fire. She carried 2 glasses of the house whiskey and settled into the chair across from him without asking permission, comfortable in a way that suggested they had progressed beyond formality. "You're planning to leave tomorrow," she said. It was not a question. "That was my intention," Brennan replied carefully. "But you're not certain anymore." Again, not a question. Catherine had a disturbing ability to read hesitation and doubt. "I've found this place more interesting than I expected," he admitted, which was absolutely true for reasons she could not begin to suspect. Catherine studied him over the rim of her glass, firelight reflecting in her eyes. "May I tell you something honestly, Jacob? Something I probably shouldn't say?" He nodded, knowing this was the moment. This was when she would make her move, whatever that entailed. "I've met hundreds of travelers over the years, thousands probably, men passing through on their way to somewhere else, always somewhere else, and they're all variations of the same types. The ambitious ones, who see only opportunities, the desperate ones who see only obstacles, the angry ones who see only injustice." She paused, taking a slow sip of whiskey. "But you're different. You see people, you listen when we talk, really listen, not just waiting for your turn to speak. You treat my sisters and me like we're more than just innkeepers serving your needs." "You are more than that," Brennan said, meaning it in ways she could not imagine. "That's what I mean." Catherine leaned forward, her voice dropping to something more intimate. "You see us, and I want you to know that we see you too, Jacob. I see you. I see a man who's been hurt and who's kept his capacity for kindness despite that hurt. I see someone who deserves more than lonely travels and empty houses." The performance was flawless. Her eyes held just the right mixture of vulnerability and attraction. Her body language suggested openness while maintaining perfect propriety. Every word was chosen to make him feel uniquely understood and valued. If he had truly been Jacob Morrison, this moment would have been devastating. A beautiful, intelligent woman essentially confessing that she saw something special in him, something worth caring about. After 2 years of loneliness and loss, such validation would have been irresistible. "Catherine," he said carefully, "I appreciate. Don't." She held up a hand, her smile sad and knowing. "Don't give me the speech about how you're not ready or how it wouldn't be appropriate. I understand. I'm not asking for anything, Jacob. I just wanted you to know that your presence here has mattered. To me. Whatever you decide about tomorrow, I want you to leave here knowing that you're seen and valued." Then she stood, kissed him gently on the forehead in a gesture that somehow managed to be both chaste and intimate, and disappeared up the stairs. Brennan sat alone by the dying fire, heart pounding, not from attraction, though he had to admit Catherine's performance would have moved a stone. No, his heart raced because he had just witnessed something truly terrifying. Catherine Cunningham had not been acting, or rather, she had been acting so completely, so thoroughly, that she believed her own performance. She had convinced herself that she genuinely cared for Jacob Morrison, that she saw something special and valuable in him. And that made her infinitely more dangerous than a simple predator faking emotion to manipulate prey. Because, when the time came to kill him, she would do it while believing she cared for him. She would poison his food or smother him in his sleep while tears ran down her face. She would bury his body in the mountains and genuinely mourn his loss, even as she counted his money and planned how to spend it. That was the real horror of what the Cunningham sisters had become. They were not monsters who had discarded their humanity to commit murder. They were human beings who had found a way to commit murder while maintaining the emotional experiences of normal people. They could care and kill simultaneously. They could form genuine connections with their victims even as they planned their deaths. Brennan had investigated many killers over his career. He had stared into eyes that held nothing but emptiness and malice, but he had never encountered anything like this. These women had created a moral framework that allowed them to be both murderers and decent human beings, at least in their own minds. They had rationalized their crimes so completely that they felt no contradiction between caring for their guests and killing them. That realization changed everything about how he needed to proceed. The next morning, Brennan announced he would be extending his stay by several more days. Margaret accepted this news with appropriate pleasure, quoting him a weekly rate that was more than reasonable. Catherine's face lit up with genuine happiness. Sarah immediately began planning special meals to help him relax and recover from the stress of travel. Elizabeth clapped her hands with delight and promised to show him more of the surrounding area. Everything was proceeding exactly as they had planned, exactly as it had proceeded for 43 men before him. But Brennan had his own plans. During his extended stay, he began taking longer walks, supposedly for exercise and fresh air. In reality, he was conducting systematic reconnaissance of the property, looking for evidence of the crimes he knew had been committed here. The trail he had spotted near the spring proved to be the first breakthrough. Following it carefully, ensuring he was not observed, Brennan discovered it led to a rocky outcropping about half a mile from the main house. The rocks formed a natural formation that concealed a narrow opening, barely large enough for a man to squeeze through. Cave systems were common in Kentucky limestone. Brennan had expected to find something like this. What he had not expected was the smell that drifted from the opening. Faint but unmistakable. The sweet, sick odor of decomposition. He did not enter the cave. Not yet. Not until he had backup and legal authority to conduct a proper search. But he marked the location carefully in his mind, noting landmarks that would allow him to find it again. Over the next 2 days, he identified 3 more cave openings, all carefully concealed, all emanating that same telltale smell. He also found areas where the soil showed signs of disturbance, places where something had been buried and the earth had settled differently than the surrounding ground. The evidence was here. scattered across the property in a pattern that showed careful planning and years of practice. Bodies hidden in caves where the mountain's chemistry would accelerate decomposition. Possessions buried in separate locations to prevent any single discovery from revealing the full scope of the crimes. Everything organized and documented by minds that understood both the practical requirements of hiding evidence and the psychological needs of maintaining their own sanity. Because that was the other thing Brennan realized during his investigation. The sisters kept records. He had seen Margaret's meticulous bookkeeping, the way she documented every detail of the inn's operations. Somewhere in this house, there would be records of what they had done. Not explicit confessions, but details that would reveal patterns, guest registries that stopped being updated when certain visitors arrived, financial records showing income that did not match the legitimate business, perhaps even personal journals where one or more of the sisters had tried to make sense of what they were doing. Finding those records would require access to the private areas of the house, areas where guests were not normally allowed. Brennan began laying groundwork for that access on his 7th evening at the inn. He had developed what appeared to be a cough, nothing serious but persistent enough to be concerning. At dinner, he apologized for the noise, attributing it to the mountain air affecting his lungs. Sarah, predictably, immediately prescribed a remedy. "I have a tea that will help, but it's most effective if taken right before sleep. I'll need to brew it fresh in my workroom. Would you like to come with me? I can show you the herbs I use." Many men find such knowledge useful when traveling. Perfect. An invitation into Sarah's private domain, where she kept her plants and her preparations, where she would almost certainly keep notes about dosages and effects. Her workroom was located in an addition to the main house, a space that was part kitchen, part apothecary, part laboratory. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling, jars and bottles filled shelves. A workbench held mortars and pestles, scales for measuring, and various tools for grinding and mixing. Sarah moved through the space with the confidence of long practice, selecting specific jars and explaining their properties as she worked. "This is boneset, for fevers. This is valerian root, for sleep. This is coltsfoot, for respiratory issues." Brennan watched carefully, noting which jars she chose and which she deliberately avoided. There, in the back corner, were plants he recognized: foxglove, hemlock, pokeweed, deadly nightshade, plants that had no legitimate medicinal purpose in the dosages available. "You have quite an extensive collection," he observed. "Knowledge is survival in a place like this," Sarah replied, measuring dried leaves with precision. "You learn what heals and what harms. Sometimes the difference is only a matter of dosage." That statement hung in the air between them, because it was absolutely true, and Sarah knew that he knew it. The same plant that could cure a cough in small amounts could stop a heart in larger doses. The line between medicine and murder was often just a question of quantity. She finished preparing the tea and handed him a cup. "Drink this slowly, right before bed. It will help clear your lungs, but don't take more than 1 cup. Too much of a good thing can cause stomach upset." Another warning. Another layer of plausible deniability. If he died tonight, there would be witnesses to Sarah telling him not to take too much. His death would be his own fault for not following medical advice. Brennan thanked her and returned to his room, where he immediately poured the tea out his window. But the visit to Sarah's workroom had given him what he needed. He had seen the poisons. He had confirmed that she had both the knowledge and the materials to kill efficiently. More importantly, he had noticed a leather-bound journal on the corner of her workbench, its pages filled with handwritten notes. That journal needed to be examined, along with Margaret's business records and any personal papers the sisters might maintain. The following evening, opportunity presented itself. A severe storm rolled through the mountains, lightning illuminating the valley and thunder shaking the building's foundations. The sisters and their employees gathered in the common room, waiting out the worst of the weather. Brennan excused himself, claiming the atmospheric pressure was aggravating a headache. He retired to his room, then waited 20 minutes before slipping out and moving silently through the darkened hallways. Margaret's office was locked, but the lock was simple. Brennan had picked more complicated mechanisms in complete darkness. He was inside within seconds. By lightning flash, he examined the contents of her desk. Guest registries going back 15 years, financial ledgers showing income and expenses, correspondence with merchants and suppliers. And there, in a locked drawer, he opened with equal ease a separate ledger, smaller than the others, bound in black leather. Brennan opened it carefully, reading by lightning flashes that turned the pages white, then dark, white, then dark. The ledger contained 2 sets of entries for every year since 1835. The left side showed the inn's legitimate income from paying guests. The right side showed something else, numbers without names, dates without explanations, but the amounts were substantial, thousands of dollars spread across each year. This was the record of their murders. Coded and obscure enough to provide deniability, but detailed enough to track income from their criminal enterprise. Margaret Cunningham, ever the meticulous businesswoman, had documented every victim and every dollar they had provided. Brennan had found his evidence. Now he needed to get it, and himself, out of Millbrook Inn alive. If you're still watching, then you understand why this story has captivated true crime enthusiasts for over a century. The Cunningham sisters were not ordinary killers. They were architects of a system so sophisticated it operated successfully for over a decade. Before you hear how this nightmare finally ended, I need you to do something. Subscribe to Macabre Mysteries of America so you never miss cases like this one. Hit that notification bell and share this video with someone who appreciates dark history told with the detail it deserves. Drop a comment telling me what aspect of this case disturbs you most, because we're about to uncover the final, darkest chapter of Millbrook Inn. The storm continued through the night, but Brennan barely noticed. He spent hours in Margaret's office, carefully documenting everything he found: the black ledger, correspondence that referenced guests who had never appeared in the official registry, land purchases that coincided suspiciously with disappearances. He worked by lightning flash, and the faint glow of a candle he kept shielded, knowing that discovery now would mean his immediate death. The sisters would have no choice but to kill him if they realized he had found their records. There would be no more games of seduction and manipulation, just quick, efficient murder by whatever means were fastest. Near dawn, he heard footsteps in the hallway. Brennan froze, candle extinguished, pressed against the wall behind Margaret's desk. The footsteps paused outside the office door. A hand tested the knob. The door was locked. He had relocked it after entering. But if whoever was outside had a key, the footsteps moved on. Probably one of the sisters checking the house after the storm, ensuring no water had leaked through the roof or no shutters had blown open. Brennan waited 10 more minutes, then carefully returned everything to its original position and slipped back to his room. He had memorized the key entries from the black ledger and noted the locations of the most damning correspondence. When he returned with proper authority, he would know exactly where to look and what to seize. But first, he needed to create an opportunity to leave without raising suspicion. At breakfast, he announced that business matters required him to cut his visit short. He had received word, he explained, of an urgent situation in Nashville that needed his attention. He would need to depart that very day. The disappointment on the sisters' faces appeared genuine. Catherine seemed particularly distressed, her eyes shining with what looked like actual tears. "So soon?" Margaret asked. "We've enjoyed having you, Mr. Morrison. I hope you'll consider returning once your business is settled." "I certainly intend to," Brennan replied, which was absolutely true. "In fact, I've been thinking about your suggestions regarding land investments. When I return, perhaps we can discuss some specific opportunities in more detail." He saw the sisters exchange glances. A wealthy businessman planning to return, potentially with even more money to invest in the area. They would let him go. They would welcome his return. And when he came back, they would be ready to complete what they had started. Except when he returned, he would not be alone. He would bring federal marshals, local law enforcement, and legal authority to search the entire property. Klaus prepared his horse while Brennan settled his bill with Margaret. The amount was more than fair. Considering the quality of accommodations and meals, he paid in gold coin, ensuring they would remember him as a man of substance worth targeting on his return. Catherine walked him to his horse. The morning sun turned her hair into spun gold. She looked beautiful and tragic and genuinely sad. "Travel safely, Jacob," she said quietly. "The mountains can be dangerous for those who don't know them well." Was that a threat, a warning, or simply a statement of fact? Brennan could not tell. Catherine's ability to blend genuine emotion with calculated manipulation was so complete that perhaps even she did not know where one ended and the other began. "I'll be careful," he promised. She stood watching as he rode down the mountain path, a solitary figure framed by the inn, beautiful and deadly and utterly convinced of her own righteousness. Brennan did not look back. He kept his horse at a steady pace until he was well out of sight of the inn, then urged the animal into a faster gait. He needed to reach Lexington. He needed to organize a proper raid. He needed to bring these women to justice before they claimed another victim. But as he rode, a thought troubled him. Something was wrong, some detail that did not fit. It took him an hour to identify what was bothering him. The storm, the footsteps outside Margaret's office, the test of the doorknob. If the sisters had suspected he was investigating them, they would not have let him leave. They would have acted immediately. Yet they had seemed genuinely disappointed by his departure and genuinely hopeful about his return, which meant they did not suspect him. They believed he was exactly who he claimed to be, unless they were better at this than he thought. Unless they had known all along who he really was and had been playing their own game within his game. No, impossible. He had been too careful. His cover was solid. The shot came from the forest above the trail. Brennan felt the bullet pass so close to his head that it disturbed his hair. His horse reared, then bolted down the mountain path. More shots, from multiple positions. They had him in a crossfire. These were not warning shots. Someone was trying to kill him. Brennan leaned low over his horse's neck, urging maximum speed despite the dangerous terrain. The horse, terrified by the gunshots, needed no encouragement. They plunged down the winding mountain trail at a pace that bordered on suicidal. Behind him, he heard shouting, men coordinating their pursuit. He caught a glimpse of Klaus Zimmer running through the trees with a rifle. Further back, Heinrich's voice calling out directions. The sisters had known. Somehow, despite all his precautions, they had identified him as a threat. And now they were trying to eliminate that threat before he could bring help. The trail descended steeply, cutting back and forth across the mountainside. Brennan's horse took the turns at full gallop, hooves sliding on loose rock. One misstep would send them both tumbling down the slope. But slowing down meant certain death from the rifles behind him. Another shot clipped his saddle. The Zimmer brothers were good with their weapons. If they had clean shots, Brennan would already be dead. His only advantage was the terrain, forcing them to shoot while running through dense forest. The trail opened into a small clearing. Brennan saw Ezra Hawthorne step out from behind a tree, rifle raised and aimed directly at his chest. There was no time to turn, no room to maneuver. The old mountain man had him dead to rights. Brennan looked into Ezra's eyes and saw something unexpected. Not hatred or determination, regret. The rifle fired. Brennan felt nothing. The horse continued running. Behind him he heard Klaus cry out. The shot had gone high. Ezra had deliberately missed. "Go!" Ezra's voice called after him. "Go and never come back. They'll kill us both now." Brennan did not stop to question this unexpected mercy. He kept riding, pushing the horse past exhaustion, racing toward Lexington and safety, and the force he would need to return and end this nightmare. The pursuit fell away as he descended below the snow line into lower elevations. The Zimmer brothers could not chase him all the way to Lexington without abandoning the sisters and the inn. Brennan reached Lexington 3 days later, his horse half dead from the grueling journey and his own body bearing the marks of a man who had not stopped moving since fleeing Millbrook Inn. He went directly to the federal courthouse, where he spent 6 hours briefing the district marshal and local law enforcement on what he had discovered. The reaction was exactly what he had feared: skepticism bordering on disbelief. 4 women, District Marshal William Coleman said slowly. "You're telling me that 4 women have murdered over 40 men and hidden the evidence so successfully that no one has suspected anything for over a decade?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Brennan replied, exhaustion making his voice harsh. "And if we don't move immediately, they'll disappear. They know I escaped. They know their operation has been compromised. Every hour we delay gives them time to destroy evidence and flee." "You have proof?" Coleman asked. "Actual evidence, beyond your observations and suspicions?" Brennan laid out what he had found. The black ledger entries showing unexplained income, the cave systems containing bodies, the correspondence referencing guests who never appeared in official records, the arsenal of poisonous plants in Sarah's workroom. It was circumstantial, all of it, strong enough to justify a search warrant, but not strong enough to guarantee convictions. Not without recovering the bodies and establishing identities. Not without finding more direct evidence of the murders. Coleman studied the map Brennan had drawn, marking the locations of the cave openings and suspicious burial sites. "If what you're saying is true, this is the most extensive criminal enterprise I've encountered in 20 years of law enforcement." "It's true," Brennan said. "And we need to move now. Today, before they have time to prepare." The raid was organized within 8 hours. 12 federal marshals, 16 local deputies, 2 experienced trackers, and a doctor qualified to examine human remains. They departed Lexington at dusk, planning to reach Millbrook Inn just after dawn, when the sisters would least expect an organized response to Brennan's escape. The column of armed men rode through the night, following the same mountain trails Brennan had fled down days earlier. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew colder and thinner. Stars wheeled overhead in patterns that looked alien to the city-raised deputies. This was wild country, hard country. The kind of place where people could disappear and never be found. The kind of place where 4 women could commit mass murder for over a decade and never face questions. They reached the final ridge overlooking the valley just as dawn painted the eastern sky pink and gold. Below them, Millbrook Inn looked peaceful and welcoming. Smoke rose from the chimneys. Lamplight glowed in several windows. Everything appeared normal. Too normal. "Something's wrong," Brennan said immediately. Marshal Coleman studied the scene through a spyglass. "Looks quiet to me. Maybe they're still sleeping?" "No. Look at the stables. The doors are open. The animals are gone." Coleman adjusted his focus. Brennan was right. The stables stood empty. No horses, no cattle in the nearby pens, no chickens scratching in the yard. "They've run," Coleman said grimly. The marshals surrounded the property and moved in from multiple directions, weapons drawn. But even before they reached the main building, Brennan knew what they would find. The inn was abandoned. Not recently abandoned. Not a panicked flight in the middle of the night. This was deliberate evacuation, planned and executed with the same precision the sisters brought to everything they did. The front door hung open. Inside, furniture remained in place, but all personal items were gone. No clothes, no jewelry, no papers or documents. The kitchen was clean and empty. The guest rooms were stripped of linens and any items of value. Margaret's office had been thoroughly cleared. The desk drawers stood open and empty. No ledgers, no correspondence, No records of any kind. Even the safe built into the wall behind a portrait had been opened and emptied. "They knew," Brennan said, staring at the empty office. "They knew I would come back with force, and they prepared." Sarah's workroom had similarly been stripped. The jars of poisonous plants were gone. The journal Brennan had seen was nowhere to be found. Even the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling had been removed. All that remained was empty shelves and the faint medicinal smell that permeated the space. "We search everything," Coleman ordered. "If there's evidence here, we find it." The marshals and deputies spent the entire day examining every inch of the inn. They tapped walls looking for hidden compartments. They examined floorboards for concealed storage. They checked the attic and the cellar, and every outbuilding on the property. They found nothing. No incriminating documents. No hidden caches of victims' possessions. No poison stores. Nothing that would prove the sisters had committed any crimes whatsoever. "The caves," Brennan said as afternoon shadows lengthened. "The bodies will still be in the caves. They couldn't move those." He led a group of 6 men to the first cave entrance he had discovered. The concealed opening near the spring, partially hidden by the rock formation. The smell of decomposition was stronger now, unmistakable in the cool mountain air. 3 deputies refused to enter. The space was too confined, too dark, too obviously a tomb. But Brennan squeezed through the narrow opening with Marshal Coleman and 2 others following, carrying lanterns that cast dancing shadows on limestone walls. The cave opened into a larger chamber about 30 feet from the entrance. And there, arranged in neat rows like a macabre warehouse, were the bodies. 43 skeletons, some still clothed in rotted fabric, some reduced to bare bone. All laid out with the same careful organization the sisters brought to every aspect of their operation. The sight was overwhelming. Even Marshal Coleman, who had seen more than his share of violent death, had to turn away and breathe deeply to maintain his composure. "My God," one of the deputies whispered. "My God in heaven." Brennan moved slowly through the rows, lantern held high. Each skeleton told a story. Here was a man who had been struck from behind, his skull showing the impact point clearly. There was a man who had been strangled, the hyoid bone in his throat fractured. Another showed signs of poisoning, the bones stained with the chemical residue of heavy metal toxins. Near the back of the cave, Brennan found what he had been searching for, a leather satchel preserved by the cave's dry atmosphere, containing personal papers, letters, a journal, a business card identifying the owner as Thomas Kellerman, cattle buyer from Richmond, Virginia, one of the first victims, missing since 1832. Other items lay scattered among the bodies: a silver pocket watch, a surveyor's compass, a Bible with a name inscribed inside. Personal effects the sisters had apparently considered too risky to keep or sell, buried here with their victims in a single mass grave that the mountains were supposed to hide forever. "We're going to need help," Coleman said, his voice hollow. "This is going to take days to process properly. We need to identify these men, notify their families, document everything for trial." "If we ever find the sisters to put on trial," Brennan replied bitterly. The other cave systems yielded similar horrors. 43 bodies total, exactly as Brennan's investigation had suggested. Each cave had been used as a dumping ground, the bodies arranged with disturbing neatness that suggested the sisters viewed them as inventory rather than human remains. The discovery of the mass graves created a sensation that spread far beyond Kentucky. Newspapers from New York to New Orleans carried stories about the 4 women who had murdered dozens of men in their remote mountain inn. Reporters descended on the area, interviewing anyone who had ever stayed at Millbrook Inn or known the Cunningham sisters. The stories that emerged painted a complex picture. Every guest who had survived their stay at the inn praised the sisters' hospitality and kindness. No one had suspected anything sinister. Many men admitted to developing romantic feelings for Catherine or emotional attachments to the family as a whole. The sisters had been universally liked and respected in the community, which made the reality of what they had done even more disturbing. The investigation into the sisters' whereabouts began immediately. Marshal Coleman organized teams to search throughout Kentucky and neighboring states. Wanted posters were distributed describing all four women in detail. Rewards were offered for information leading to their capture. The search was complicated by one crucial factor. The sisters had money, lots of it. The black ledger Brennan had seen might be gone, but the evidence of their wealth was clear from property records and business investments. They had accumulated thousands of dollars from their victims over the years, and they had taken that money with them when they fled. With sufficient funds, four intelligent women could disappear quite effectively in 1847 America. They could purchase new identities, travel to cities where no one knew them, establish themselves in legitimate businesses, live comfortably for years or even decades without ever being connected to the crimes at Millbrook Inn. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after the raid, Ezra Hawthorne walked into the federal marshal's office in Lexington and surrendered himself. The old mountain man looked like he had aged a decade in those 3 weeks. His face was gaunt. His hands trembled. His eyes held the haunted look of someone who had seen too much and could no longer carry the weight alone. "I need to confess," he told Coleman simply. "I need to tell the truth about what happened at that inn. Before I die and take these secrets to hell with me." Ezra's testimony, given over the course of 3 days and documented in meticulous detail, provided the missing pieces of the story. He confirmed Brennan's suspicions about the sisters' operation, described specific murders he had witnessed or assisted with, and most importantly, revealed where the sisters had gone. "They had it planned for years," Ezra explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "Margaret always knew this day might come. She had contingencies, false identities prepared. Property purchased under assumed names in cities far from Kentucky. They split up the day after Mr. Morrison escaped, went in 4 different directions to make tracking harder." "Where?" Coleman demanded. "Which cities?" "Margaret went to St. Louis. She had investments there under the name Margaret Wilson. Catherine took a riverboat to New Orleans. Planned to book passage on a ship to France eventually. Sarah headed north, talking about going to Boston or maybe even Canada. And Elizabeth." Ezra paused, genuine pain crossing his weathered features. Elizabeth was the youngest, the most conflicted about what they'd done. She wanted out, wanted to start over somewhere no one knew her. She talked about going west, maybe all the way to California. "Why are you telling us this now?" Brennan asked. "You've been loyal to the Cunninghams for decades. You even let me escape when you had a clear shot. Why turn on them now?" Ezra looked at him with eyes that held equal parts guilt and defiance. "Because I'm dying. Doctor says I've got maybe 6 months. Consumption, same thing that killed Jeremiah Cunningham all those years ago. And I can't go to my grave knowing those women are out there, free and unpunished, while 43 good men are buried in mountain caves like they never mattered." He coughed, a wet, rattling sound that confirmed his self-diagnosis. "I helped them. God forgive me. I helped them hide bodies and sell stolen property and lie to anyone who came asking questions. I told myself I was just being loyal to the family I'd served since I was a young man. But loyalty to evil is just evil by another name, and I want to face my judgment having at least tried to make things right." Based on Ezra's information, Marshal Coleman coordinated with law enforcement in multiple cities. The hunt for the Cunningham sisters became a multi-state operation involving federal marshals, local police, and even private detectives hired by families of the victims. Margaret was found first. Living in St. Louis under the name Margaret Wilson, she had established herself as a respectable widow operating a boarding house for businessmen. The boarding house was entirely legitimate, no murders, just clean rooms and fair prices. But when marshals arrested her in September of 1847, they found over $3,000 in gold coin hidden in her cellar, along with personal items belonging to several Millbrook Inn victims. She maintained her innocence throughout the arrest, trial, and even up to the moment the noose was placed around her neck in March of 1848. Margaret Cunningham died, insisting that any evidence found against her had been fabricated by people jealous of her success. She went to the gallows with the same cold composure she had displayed throughout her murderous career. Catherine proved more elusive. She had indeed gone to New Orleans, but by the time marshals tracked her there, she had already booked passage on a ship bound for France. The vessel was intercepted before it left American waters, and Catherine was found in a first-class cabin, traveling under the name Catherine Beaumont. Unlike her sister, Catherine broke down completely when arrested. She confessed to everything, weeping as she described how they had selected victims, how they had killed them, how they had hidden the evidence. Her testimony provided crucial details that confirmed Ezra's account and filled in gaps in the prosecution's understanding of the operation. But Catherine's confession came with a twist that disturbed everyone who heard it. She genuinely believed that she had cared for her victims. She insisted that she had developed real feelings for many of the men she had helped murder. In her mind, she had not been a cold-blooded killer, but a tragic figure forced by circumstances to destroy the very people she loved. The jury was unimpressed by this logic. Catherine was convicted and sentenced to hang alongside her sister Margaret. The two women were executed on the same day, March 15, 1848, before a crowd of over 2,000 spectators who had traveled from across the region to witness justice being done. Sarah Cunningham was arrested in Boston in November of 1847. She had been working as an herbalist and midwife under an assumed name, using her genuine medical knowledge to build a new, legitimate life. When marshals searched her rooms, they found extensive journals documenting her experiments with various plant toxins, including detailed notes about which substances worked best for different purposes and which left the least detectable traces. These journals became crucial evidence at trial. They proved beyond doubt that Sarah had possessed both the knowledge and the materials necessary to commit the murders. They also revealed something chilling about her mindset. She had approached killing the way a scientist approaches research, methodically testing hypotheses and refining her techniques based on results. Sarah showed no emotion at her trial. She refused to speak in her own defense. When sentenced to death, she simply nodded as if the verdict confirmed something she had already known. She was hanged in June of 1848, the last of the three oldest sisters to face execution. Elizabeth presented the most complicated case. She was arrested in Illinois in January of 1848, living on a small farm under the name Elizabeth Hart. Unlike her sisters, she had fled with relatively little money and had been working as a seamstress to support herself. Her youth and her apparent willingness to testify against her sisters created sympathy that the older women never received. Her defense attorney argued that she had been essentially enslaved by Margaret, forced to participate in crimes she abhorred but was too frightened and powerless to prevent. The jury was divided. Some believed Elizabeth had been a genuine victim. Others saw her as simply the most skilled actress of the four sisters, deploying innocence and vulnerability as weapons, just as Catherine had deployed beauty and Sarah had deployed medical knowledge. The compromise verdict reflected this division. Elizabeth was convicted but sentenced to life imprisonment rather than death. She was 24 years old when she entered the Kentucky State Penitentiary in August of 1848. She would spend the next 41 years behind those walls. Prison records describe Elizabeth as a model inmate. She taught other prisoners to read and write. She worked in the prison laundry and later in the medical ward, using knowledge learned from Sarah to help treat sick and injured inmates. She attended every religious service offered and was reported to spend hours in prayer and meditation. But she never spoke publicly about what had happened at Millbrook Inn. She declined all requests for interviews from journalists and crime writers. She refused to discuss her sisters or her crimes with anyone, except occasionally with prison chaplains, and even then, only in the context of seeking spiritual forgiveness rather than providing historical information. Elizabeth Cunningham died in prison in 1889 at the age of 65. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia. She was buried in the prison cemetery under her assumed name, Elizabeth Hart, as she had requested. Whatever final secrets she carried about the murders at Millbrook Inn died with her. The Zimmer brothers faced charges as accessories to murder. Klaus, who had been more directly involved in the disposal of bodies and concealment of evidence, was sentenced to 15 years in prison. He served 11 before being released for good behavior in 1859. He disappeared into the Western Territories and was never heard from again. Heinrich Zimmer, the younger brother whose growing instability had concerned the sisters in their final months of operation, was found to be mentally incompetent to stand trial. He was committed to a state asylum, where he died in 1852, reportedly still plagued by nightmares about the men he had helped bury in mountain caves. Ezra Hawthorne never faced formal charges. His cooperation with investigators and his terminal illness convinced prosecutors that prosecution would serve no useful purpose. He died in December of 1847, exactly 6 months after his confession, in a boarding house in Lexington. His last words, according to the landlady who attended him, were an apology to the 43 men whose names he had memorized from the victim list. The disposal of Millbrook Inn property took years to resolve. The land itself was seized by the federal government as proceeds of crime. The buildings were demolished in 1849 after being repeatedly vandalized by people seeking souvenirs or simply wanting to destroy a place associated with such evil. The property was eventually sold at auction, with proceeds going to compensate victims' families where possible, but many of the victims had no families to compensate. They had been alone in the world, which was precisely why the Cunningham sisters had selected them. The process of identifying all 43 bodies stretched across 2 years. Some victims were identified through personal items found with their remains. Others were matched to missing person reports based on physical characteristics and timing of disappearances. A few were never conclusively identified, known only by descriptions of their clothing or possessions. Each identified victim's family was notified and offered the opportunity to claim remains for proper burial. Some families made the journey to Kentucky to retrieve their loved ones. Others requested that the remains be interred locally, wanting closure but not wanting to relive the trauma through a long journey. For the unidentified victims, a memorial was erected near the site where Millbrook Inn once stood. A simple stone marker bearing 43 names, those that were known, and the words, "Also, here remembered, are those travelers whose names are known only to God." The Millbrook Inn case fundamentally changed how law enforcement approached missing person investigations in frontier regions. The idea that a respectable business could serve as cover for systematic murder was not new, but the scale and sophistication of the Cunningham operation shocked investigators throughout the country. New protocols were developed for tracking travelers and investigating establishments in isolated areas. Requirements for guest registries became more stringent. Local sheriffs began conducting more frequent inspections of remote inns and boarding houses. The concept of using patterns of disappearances to identify potential serial crimes entered standard investigative practice. The case also sparked public fascination that continues to this day. The story of 4 women who murdered dozens of men challenged contemporary assumptions about gender and violence. Victorians struggled to reconcile the image of feminine domesticity and nurturing with the brutal reality of what the Cunningham sisters had accomplished. Numerous books, plays, and eventually films dramatized the story, often taking substantial liberties with the facts. Some portrayals depicted the sisters as victims of circumstance, forced into crime by poverty and desperation. Others painted them as she-devils, who seduced and destroyed men for pleasure as much as profit. The truth, as is so often the case, was more complex and more disturbing than either extreme. What made the Cunningham sisters truly terrifying was not that they were monsters. It was that they were human, intelligent, capable, even charming human beings who had simply decided that other people's lives mattered less than their own comfort and prosperity. They had not killed in passion or rage or even hatred. They had killed as a business decision, eliminating assets when those assets became more valuable dead than alive. And they had done it for over 15 years without anyone suspecting, without anyone questioning the warm welcome and exceptional hospitality offered by 4 women in a remote Kentucky inn. The site where Millbrook Inn once stood is now part of the Daniel Boone National Forest. The valley where 43 men met their deaths is covered in second-growth timber, the original clearing long since reclaimed by the wilderness. Hikers occasionally pass through without realizing they are walking ground soaked in the blood of one of America's most successful serial killing operations. The caves where the bodies were discovered have been permanently sealed by the National Forest Service, both as a safety measure and out of respect for the dead. But local people still tell stories about the valley, about strange sounds heard in the forest at night, about feelings of unease that descend on visitors for no apparent reason, about shadows that move when no one is there to cast them. Whether these stories represent genuine hauntings or simply the weight of historical horror seeping into local consciousness is impossible to say. What is certain is that the memory of what happened at Millbrook Inn has not faded despite the passage of time. The case serves as a reminder that evil does not always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it wears a welcoming smile and offers hot meals and clean beds to weary travelers. Sometimes it looks like 4 sisters trying to survive in a harsh frontier environment. Sometimes it seems so normal, so respectable, so caring that its true nature remains hidden until it is far too late. Marshal Thomas Brennan never fully recovered from his experience at Millbrook Inn. He continued his law enforcement career for another 15 years, but colleagues noted that something had changed in him after Kentucky. He became more suspicious, more cautious, less willing to take people at face value. In his private journals, published after his death in 1873, Brennan wrote extensively about the Cunningham sisters and what they represented. He struggled to understand how 4 people could commit such atrocities while maintaining the appearance and even the internal experience of being good, caring individuals. "I have faced many criminals in my career," he wrote, "robbers, murderers, con artists, thugs of every description. But I never encountered anyone quite like the Cunningham sisters. They were not simply pretending to be good people while secretly being evil. They genuinely believed themselves to be good people who were simply doing what was necessary to survive. They had created a moral framework in which murder was justified, even virtuous, when committed against those who would not be missed. That capacity for self-deception, for rewriting reality to suit one's desires, that is perhaps the most terrifying human quality I have ever witnessed." The last word on the Millbrook Inn murders came from an unexpected source. In 1903, over 50 years after the executions, a package arrived at the Kentucky Historical Society. Inside was a letter and a small journal bound in faded leather. The letter was unsigned, but claimed to be from a granddaughter of one of the sisters. The journal, the letter explained, had been hidden for decades, but the writer felt it was time for the full truth to be revealed. The journal was Catherine's. Written during the years at Millbrook Inn, it provided an intimate look at how the sisters justified their crimes to themselves and to each other. The entries ranged from cold discussions of victim selection to anguished meditations on guilt and morality. Some passages described genuine affection for men the sisters later murdered. Others detailed the mechanics of killing with disturbing clinical precision. One entry, dated October 1846, captured the strange moral universe the sisters had created for themselves. "We did what we had to do. Father left us property but no protection, no means of support beyond what we could create ourselves. Society expects women to be weak, to be dependent, to accept whatever fate men choose to give us. But we refused that fate. We built something from nothing. We survived in a world that wants women to fail. If men had to die for us to succeed, then that is simply the price of our survival. They came to us voluntarily. They wanted what we offered. And in their final moments, they died believing they were cared for. Is that not more mercy than most men receive? We gave them comfort before the end. We made them feel valued. That is more than this cruel world typically provides. The journal entry that followed that passage described, in detail, the murder of a land surveyor who had stayed at the inn for 3 weeks and had fallen deeply in love with Catherine. She had poisoned his final meal herself while crying, genuinely moved by his declarations of love, even as she killed him. Historians debate whether the journal is authentic. Some experts believe it is a later fabrication, created by someone capitalizing on the enduring fascination with the Cunningham case. Others point to details in the journal that match known facts not publicly available at the time it supposedly surfaced. Authentic or not, the journal captures something true about the Millbrook Inn murders. The ability of human beings to commit terrible acts while maintaining their self-image as good, even noble people. The capacity to care for someone while simultaneously destroying them. The strange coexistence of genuine emotion and calculated cruelty that defines certain types of killers. Today, the Cunningham sisters are studied in criminal psychology courses as examples of organized serial killers who use their victims' emotional vulnerabilities as weapons. Their case is cited in discussions of female serial killers, predatory hospitality businesses, and the particular dangers faced by isolated travelers in the 19th century. But beyond the academic analysis, the story of Millbrook Inn remains a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolation and the monsters that can thrive in places far from oversight and accountability. It reminds us that the wilderness holds more than just natural dangers. Sometimes the greatest threats come not from wolves or bears or hostile terrain, but from human beings who have learned to hide their true nature behind welcoming smiles and offers of comfort. The 43 men who died at Millbrook Inn were not heroes or villains. They were ordinary people making their way through a difficult world. Merchants trying to build businesses, workers seeking opportunities. Travelers moving toward whatever futures they imagined for themselves. They stopped at an inn that promised rest and safety. They encountered women who seemed kind and caring, and they died, never understanding that the warmth they had been so grateful to find was the same fire that would consume them. Their names, those that are known, are preserved in the memorial near the site of the old inn. Their stories, pieced together from letters and journals and legal documents, remind us that behind every cold statistic about historical crime are individual human beings who deserved better than the fates they received. And somewhere in the Kentucky mountains, in caves sealed for over a century and a half, the bones of those 43 men rest in darkness. Silent witnesses to one of America's most chilling true crime stories, a story of hospitality twisted into horror, of feminine charm weaponized for murder, of a place where travelers sought refuge and found only death. The Cunningham sisters are long dead now, executed or imprisoned, their names synonymous with betrayal and calculated evil. But their legacy endures as a warning that sometimes the greatest danger comes not from obvious threats, but from those who seem most eager to help, from those who offer exactly what we need most desperately, from those who make us feel safe just before destroying us completely. This is the true story of Millbrook Inn, a place where love was promised and death delivered, where 43 men came seeking comfort and found graves instead, where 4 sisters built an empire on the corpses of the lonely and vulnerable, a story that reminds us that evil does not always look like evil. Sometimes it looks like home. If this story has left you thinking about the dark corners of American history, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below telling me which aspect of the Cunningham case disturbed you most. Was it their systematic selection of victims? Their ability to care and kill simultaneously? The fact that they operated successfully for over 15 years? Or something else entirely? Your thoughts and insights make this community what it is. And if you found value in this deep dive into one of America's most complex true crime cases, please share this video with others who appreciate history told with the depth and detail it deserves. Together, we can ensure these stories and the lessons they teach are never forgotten. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember that the past has more secrets than we could ever uncover in 100 lifetimes.